Hello, and welcome to the last in our series of Residence Academy presentations for this spring. We hope you've enjoyed the topics that we've presented so far, and we thank Leslie and Susan for making these possible in a virtual setting. My name is Janine Reagan, and I'm going to be talking today about implicit biases and how they sneak up on us. In a way, this is kind of a continuation of the presentation I did last month on habits. Last month we talked about primarily behavioral habits, why they're, we get them and how they are kind of hard to change. And we talked a little bit about thought habits. Today we're going to get into that quite a bit more. But I'd like to start out by sharing with you an experience that I had, it was a few months ago. It was pre-COVID-19. One evening, my husband Bernie and I had the occasion to visit the emergency room with a friend of ours who was having chest pain. And you know that routine, right? The squad comes, picks up the person, we follow in the car, and when we got to the waiting room, because of some name mix-up, we ended up sitting there for about an hour before we got in to see our friend. Once we did, it was a long wait, and you're always wrapped up in blankets because it's so cold. But the nurse came in regularly and updated us on what was happening, telling us what tests were being done and what results had been shown. And around 10:30, she came in and said that so far all the tests were good, but of course there's always one more, and that would take about an hour. So about an hour and 15 minutes later, she came back in and said that that test was also good, so that they would start the discharge paperwork for our friend, and that would happen in a few minutes. But of course, the concept of a few minutes in the emergency room is a little different than it is outside. So it was 40 minutes before we saw another person. At that time, a young, short, slightly overweight black woman with lots of braids, dressed in dark gray scrubs with a stethoscope around her neck, entered the room and stood at the end of our friend's bed. She began to talk about discharge and follow-up. I was sitting to the side and could not see her name tag. But partway through the conversation, I realized, much to my great surprise, that this was the doctor. I was immediately struck by the degree of surprise I experienced in this revelation. I was surprised at my surprise. But frankly, I was too tired to think about it any further, and at that time all I wanted to focus on was getting our friend back to her home and getting us back to bed. So the next morning, as I was lying in bed and thinking about this, I could not keep my mind off how surprised I had been that this woman was the doctor. After all, I'm an enlightened baby boomer. I shouldn't have such biases. I worked hard to see the world and those in it in an accepting and non-judging way. So I got up and I grabbed a piece of scrap paper and I started to write down all the variables that I thought might have been a factor in my perception that this woman had to be a nurse or a clerk or something other than the doctor. It kind of went like this. If the person had been a tall white guy, would I have seen him as the doctor right away? Probably. If the person had been a tall black guy, would I have seen him as the doctor? Most likely. If he'd been Indian or Asian male, yes. If she had been a tall white woman, maybe, maybe not. A tall black woman or a short black woman, maybe, maybe not. An Indian woman? Oh, probably, because we know they're never nurses. Oh, maybe that's a bias. An older person? That might have helped. So you get it. I went through it all. Race, height, body build, age, gender, hair, dress. Oh. What I concluded was that I still expect doctors to be male, older, and it would help if they wore a white coat. The white coat would have been a giveaway. Yes, I am still looking for Marcus Welby for Dr. Kildare. In the absence of that cue, the white coat, my mind went to other stereotypes that had dominated the culture in which I had grown up, such as women are nurses, men are doctors, doctors are older people, and they don't look like they just graduated from high school. I was not happy about any of this insight. I wanted to think of myself as having put those biases about roles away in favor of a broader perspective. But, as a psychologist, I know that a great deal of what we think, say, and how we act is impacted by beliefs and feelings that reside in our unconscious minds and got put there a long time ago. If you remember from my last talk, I likened our conscious and unconscious mind as an iceberg, with a small portion visible above the waterline, that's our conscious mind, and a much larger part below the waterline, our unconscious mind. What we do and why we do it throughout the day is largely a function of the stuff in the bottom part. And the example that I used at that time was, remember when you first learned to drive a car. Everything that you did was very conscious, every step along the way. But after you had practiced it over and over and over again, you download it into the bottom part of the iceberg and it becomes an automatic behavior. The same thing happens with our beliefs and how we think about ourselves in the world. You see, our brains have a natural tendency to make automatic judgments about people and groups based on the survival of our ancestors. That is, having to recognize quickly who was part of your tribe, or who was friend and who was foe. It has been important to be efficient in discerning danger from not danger. The development of stereotypes has been part of that efficiency. The learning of relevant cues for such decisions begins early in life and is evident by age 3. The two most influential sources being our immediate culture, family, friends, teachers, and in modern times, the media, particularly TV and social media. As social psychologists examine trends in these two influences, they're finding, as you might suspect and worry, that social media is becoming more powerful in this area of influence, even surpassing the influence of family in many cases. Now that is a topic for another time. According to Keith Payne, professor of psychology and neuroscience at UNC Chapel Hill, having stereotypes pop up in our mind happens to most people all the time. It doesn't make you a racist, a sexist, or a whateverist. It just means that your brain is working properly, noticing patterns and making generalizations. But the same thought processes that make us smart can also make us biased. This tendency for stereotype-confirming thoughts to pass spontaneously through our minds is what psychologists call implicit bias. It sets people up to overgeneralize sometimes, leading to discrimination even when people feel that they're being fair. Payne, who has researched extensively on racial bias, goes on to highlight examples of research on how real-world discrimination continues and is widespread. For instance, white applicants get about 50% more callbacks than black applicants for the same job with the same resume. College professors are 26% more likely to respond to a student's email when it is signed from Brad than if it's from Lamar. Physicians recommend less pain medication for black patients than white patients with the same injury. And these examples are only looking at racial bias. Many other types of bias have been studied, including gender, body type, disabilities, culture, politics, age, even music preference, just to name a few. Diversity consultant and passionate speaker on implicit bias, Verna Myers, describes bias as the stories we make up about people before we know who they are. Listen to that again. The stories we make up about people before we know who they are. Now think about that. Think about when you meet somebody for the first time and you know little about them. Or think about when you see somebody acting in a particular way and you don't know why. What are the stories that we make up in our own mind about that person without knowing, without having much information? This definition recently came home for me when I was watching the NPR documentary Country Music by Ken Burns and realized that I had no idea who Johnny Cash really was. My story about him was that he was a country singer with a kind of rough history, including drug use, and a hillbilly style of singing, which was really not my cup of tea, but I did like his song, A Boy Named Sue. I had never seen him for the impact he had on breaking down racial and gender barriers across the entire American music scene in the 50s and 60s. Of the 8 segments of Burns's program, 6 of them revisited Cash's career at various points, his highs and his lows. But each episode presented examples of the ways in which he brought black musicians and female singers into his concerts and TV specials in ways that had never been heard of in the country music scene. I now have a very different story of Johnny Cash. If implicit bias is so important and so sneaky, how do we study it then? Well, one way of examining implicit bias has been to use tests, the most popular being the implicit association test and the Harvard implicit bias test. Both have been used for decades to research the occurrence of many different biases amongst large demographic groups. While these instruments are best used to look at trends across groups, they can be useful in making us aware of biases we may not realize we have and that still operate to influence our behaviors, both verbal and nonverbal. If you're curious and a little brave, you can be part of this research by Googling Harvard Implicit Bias Test and opting into the Implicit Project. There you can pick from several biases, and you can take as many tests as you want, and get immediate results about the direction and strength of biases that you might have. The tests use reaction times, so it's pretty hard to fake it. Another concept that is related to implicit bias, but one that you may not have heard much about yet, is microaggression. Microaggression is defined as brief, subtle, stunning insults that can be verbal, nonverbal, or visual. They include everyday exchanges that send demeaning messages through intonation, gestures, dismissive looks, or put-downs, and are directed to certain individuals because of their group membership. If my bias for who can be a doctor had translated into an action, such as saying to that young woman, "Oh, you're the doctor?" Or, "Does our friend have to see a doctor before she can be discharged?" it would have become a microaggression. One research project looked at cashiers in grocery stores. They took videos of white cashiers handing money back to the customer. And what they found was that a large percentage of the time, that when the cashier was white and the customer was white, they handed the money back to the person in their hand. When the cashier was white and the customer was black or Hispanic, they tended to lay the cash on the counter and let the person pick it up. This is a microaggression. This says, I treat you differently because you belong to a certain group. If letting these sneaky biases have their way with you is something you don't want, here are some suggestions on how we can best cope with our own implicit biases. When a bias is in the form of an automatic thought, feeling, or action, and it pops up, notice it without judging or beating yourself up. When you beat yourself up about it, you've only increased your own angst with no change in the stuff below the waterline in that iceberg. Secondly, look at the event with curiosity about possible triggers. What might have brought this bias up from its depths? Take into account your resources at the time. For instance, it's almost midnight. I'm cold, tired, hungry. There is no white coat. Because we know that when we are under stress, when resources are low, or when we're frightened, our higher thinking brain tends to go offline, and we function from the more of the stuff in the lower part of the iceberg. As Verna Myers calls this, this is our default setting. Next, how else can we change an ingrained default bias? Change can happen through exposure and repetition. If you identify a bias that just seems stuck in the bottom of your iceberg, one way to start melting it is to create enough experience to change your own default setting. For example, let's say you are a business owner who is interviewing job candidates for a supervisory position in your business. Your modern self says that you give everyone equal consideration, but when you take the Harvest Implicit Bias test, you find your default setting still shows a strong preference for people without disabilities over people who have disabilities. To add to the evidence, videos of your past interviews with applicants clearly show that when conducting the interview with a person with a disability, such as someone in a wheelchair, your behaviors, your eye contact, whether you're smiling or sitting forward or leaning back, fidgeting with your pen, is different with different applicants. These results are upsetting to you, but now you know. So you decide you will go after this bias and change it as much as you can. You call in your diversity consultant, who suggests that you create exposure by looking at pictures of people with disabilities functioning in job situations. So you do this every day for 2 weeks. You read stories and accounts of people with disabilities who have been successful in the workplace, and then you find an opportunity to work with people with disabilities on a project that incorporates some kind of common goal. You may not totally eliminate the default setting, but you can create an awareness that helps you to reduce the influence that old stuff has on your decision making in the present. So what can we do about microaggressions? Because we're not aware of them. Because microaggressions are driven by implicit and sometimes explicit, that is, biases that we are aware of, and they keep biases keep us at excuse me. Keep looking at your own thoughts and behaviors in order to become aware of them, and then apply techniques listed beforehand, the ones that we've already talked about. Awareness alone can lead to change in behavior. Remember that forgiveness and non-judgment of yourself regarding these biases is an important part. If you see microaggressions in others who seem unaware, find a polite way to point it out. The cashier example might be handled with a statement like, "Gee, I noticed something interesting when you hand change back to customers. Describe what you observed." And then, It's amazing how we all have these kinds of habits that we're just totally unaware of. Keep judgment out of your response. Give information. As I've said before, far too often we are like the Titanic. We just don't see the bottom of that iceberg until we run into it. But we have better sonar than the Titanic. We can equip ourselves with awareness and determination that both recognizes our humanness in combating our biases and motivates us to take the steps necessary to limit their impact. I, for one, don't think I will ever be so surprised again at who can be the doctor. Thank you. And please join us in the fall when our Residence Academy resumes. We'll have a whole list of new topics for you. We don't know if it'll be in person or if it will be virtual, but we look forward to presenting those again in the fall. Thank you.